Hello everyone, welcome to a new process mining cafe. Over here in Europe we are almost going into a long weekend, and at the end of this somewhat shorter week we're doing a new cafe with a very common topic about data preparations. I'm here with Rudi. Hi Rudi. And what we wanted to do, right, Rudi, is to collect some of the common questions that we hear a lot when people get started with process mining. And there's so many things that reoccur, so we wanted to put them together and go about some of the questions that we see a lot.
Data extraction and data preparation is, of course, one of the first challenges you often encounter when you start with process mining.
And a lot of the questions are coming up, of course, about what about the data? How do we go about the data? So we collect some of those for you. We also show you some two common examples of data preparation that we see a lot. So that I think can be helpful. And of course you can participate. So we are live on the stream on this website where you are seeing this right now. Just below you can enter a chat. You don't need an account or anything. Just type in your name and you are in the chat, and there you can add your experience or ask any questions, and we keep an eye on that throughout the session. All right, so let's get started. So I think really, right, one of the most common questions that people have, especially if they're really new to process mining, is they're wondering, what about these logs? Where are these logs coming from? So where are they coming from?
Yeah. So one of the advantages is that they can come from everywhere, right? So we get this question often, and then people say, where do I get these type of logs? Which systems do I need to request to have these logs available? And we see that data for process mining is being collected from various type of systems. So particular systems we see quite often are workflow systems, because they tend to have this type of data already readily available in this particular format. So if we're looking at a workflow, then it's composed of activities that are executed for a certain case. And these activities are then being logged. So it's quite easy to get this type of data out of the particular system. And other type of sources are clickstreams, for example. So clickstreams have a case that's often a user that is clicking through a website, and each click that's being produced also triggers the collection of timestamps and, of course, URLs, which can be abbreviated into.
Right. That's something that people often don't think about, right? So that clickstream also could be a data source.
Yeah. But there are many more, right? So it also doesn't contain to a particular domain or even a particular area. So production systems also tend to collect this type of data. More obvious, which is used very frequently, these example of purchasing processes in ERP systems, or purchase to pay, order to cash. But other type of systems are project management systems, or systems that are kind of used for software development, for example. And then you can also track these activities. You can find patterns, how people are working together. Often they call it then sprints, or what's kind of the lead time of these projects, what kind of rework do we see as part of a project? Do they at least have the milestones available in this project, more from a compliance point of view?
Yeah, we had this example once at the process mining camp, right, with the Jira. Jira data.
Yeah, that's very nice. Where they compared multiple teams together to have best practices across these teams. And there are more specific type of use cases. So, for example, if we are looking in the medical area, for example, in hospitals, they have these hospital-specific systems. And these, of course, are very detailed in logging. So we see quite a lot of detailed logging there. But in hospitals, you also have a lot of devices like MRI scanners or radiology systems. And these systems itself also produce loggings, right? So the logging is then not coming from one system solely, but it can be combined from multiple systems together to get kind of a complete understanding. So how is that MRI scanner being used as part of the diagnosis process? And how does that work in contrast with a medical specialist, for example?
Yeah, exactly. I think the one thing that's important to remember is that you don't need any specific system to work with process mining. It's not that any of these systems that Rudi just mentioned were made with process mining in mind. They have been around for a long time. You can apply process mining to legacy systems that were made in the 80s or earlier. So that's not the point. And none of these systems are made for process mining. And also, you're not looking for kind of technical logs, right? Sometimes that can be a little bit misleading because the term that we use in the process mining space to refer to the type of data that we need, we call it event log. But when people hear log, sometimes they think of something very technical, like a Apache server log or something like that. But that's more unstructured and more technical. But with process mining, you're not looking for technical logs because you also want to analyze the process on a business level, right? So you're looking for data on the process level, on the business level on which you want to analyze it. And the good news is that if there's any system that supports the process, is it a hospital system or whether it's a production system, doesn't matter. The important milestones that happen in the process, they are usually captured somehow in the information system. And that's what you then go and look for when you create your data.
And so to give already some interesting examples, so sometimes you see that people have either a challenge to find these particular logs, and sometimes they are not readily available. But one of the interesting examples is, for example, from an auditing point of view, they are looking for the logs, cannot find it, and then eventually there was kind of a check mark in that system in order to enable this traceability logging, and then eventually they were able to collect it. So it doesn't mean that if you cannot find it in the system itself, that it is not available or it's not possible to collect it in a certain way, because the functionality is often there.
Sometimes that's a good point. Sometimes you need to switch on the logging. Yeah, that's true. But even if there's not a logging at all, so even if it's in some kind of business database or something. So, for example, if you think of a sales process, in the context of the sales process, at some point in time, there's maybe an offer being sent to a prospective new customer. Somewhere in the business system, there will be at least a date when that offer or that contract was sent to the customer. And then what you're trying to do with process mining is to go into the system and find where is this timestamp, when that particular activity happens. So, and that's already kind of coming to the chicken and an egg problem, right? So we can look for data. So we here are kind of starting with the data. But of course, we are trying to understand the process, right? So it doesn't mean that the data source, which we have, it could explain multiple processes, right? So we have a very nice example where we have a data set of an HR process, but it contains different type of processes. So it contains the reimbursement processes, but also the onboarding and the offboarding process. So then you need to unweave each of these processes from this whole data set. So that's also kind of part of the data collection to understand what part of the process you want to analyze. Yeah, exactly. And it's also a little bit of a chicken and egg problem because you need to know a little bit what kind of process you're looking for to ask for the data, right? And I think that's something that we will come back to multiple times throughout this session because it's a really important point that you really have to think about the process that you want to analyze and understand that. That's nothing you can get around. It's not just getting data and, process mining is doing it automatically. You have to build up this understanding, but also you have to get the data somewhere, right? So we also wanted to briefly talk about, who do you get the data from? And we brought this slide as a reminder of the different roles in the process mining project. So let me bring that up. Let me know when you can see the slide, and then so who do you go to really when you want to extract data?
So one of the challenges, of course, of collecting process mining data is understanding where the data is coming from, whether or not it is available right now, in the right way, and then also how to get it into the right format. So there are kind of multiple stages in order to get the data. So often when I start looking for data, I start looking actually at the system that is being used by the domain expert, because that's kind of closest to the point telling me whether or not there should be some kind of timestamps available. So often, for example, in IT service management systems, if you look at a particular request, for example, you see this overview of the history of all the actions that actually happened as part of that request. So that kind of already is an indication that it should be there, independent of in which format it can be offered. So if we are then looking at the whole structure of where the data is coming from, then the data can come from existing reporting. So that means maybe the user itself can export the data quite easily. But if the data is not readily available, then of course you need to go back to the roles that are maintaining the system. And so the IT administrators of that particular system. And if they don't know, then it could also be that they need to dig deeper, right, to understand, okay, what kind of data structures are in the database technically, and how they are kind of related to each other in order to generate or create these type of event logs. And then you see that the whole supporting system or organization is kind of needed in order to get the data out and prepare it into the right format. And that's also one of the big challenges we see, that people think, okay, it's quite easy. We get the data and then we load it into a process mining tool. But then they are realizing that understanding whether or not the data is available, where it's sitting, to get it out and to get it into the right format. And then we actually need multiple roles in order to get this done. So ideally, this one person who can do everything all together, that's the ideal world. But often this is not the case. We cannot do this alone. So it requires multiple roles to get this done.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes it is one person who can fulfill multiple roles. So the green ones, by the way, are a little bit in the slide that we've just shown, are the roles that are closest to, let's say, the process miner. The process miners themselves, right? So the data analyst is the one really using the process mining tool, applying the filters, doing the analysis. But you also need the business analyst who's able to basically interpret what they're seeing from, for example, a process improvement perspective, or if you're an auditor with the audit methodology. So it's the organizational context in which you use process mining. But then also we have the data specialist, and that, of course, is very relevant also for the topic today, where we see that at a certain point in time, especially if you have large data sets, you might need certain skills to work with large data sets, to combine them, to transform them, to get them ready for process mining. And because they're quickly too big to fit into Excel, for example. And what you see is that there are, for example, big data specialists in companies who can do these transformations. But then if the process mining analyst does not have those skills themselves, they have to work with this person and they have to tell them what data transformation they need to make and how they need to shape the data correctly.
Yeah. So it's already very relevant what kind of question you have in order to prepare the data, right? So it's not simple in a sense that you have kind of the source data and you bring it into one format and then you are there, right? So you have kind of the result, what you actually need. But it's kind of depending on what type of questions you have to change the shape of the data exactly right to answer this particular question. And this also requires then the feedback loop. So it's more or less a multidisciplinary team that needs to work together to bring out a result, to do this type of analysis instead of just simply request the data and then we are kind of done. And so often what's the effect is you start requesting the data once from either the system administrator or requiring any data expert in order to get the data right. And then a few weeks later, you are requesting the data in a slightly different way. And then you are requesting it again. And then you get kind of the irritation going on because people don't understand why are you getting back every time with a slightly different question. And that's where you are shaping the data. And if they don't realize this, then it's very difficult to be able to work together. So sometimes it's good to have this knowledge from the start that you can kind of operate as a team, or have a way where you can do it more flexible. So that means that some part of the data preparation in the beginning, you are doing this on a smaller set, maybe yourself, to clarify how this works. And then get to a point where you can explain very concretely what you have done so that someone else can either replicate this or understand how they can deliver it in a more flexible way.
Yeah. And in general, it's good to expect that this will be an iterative process. It's very unlikely that it's going to be right the first time, but you will probably have to go through multiple cycles of getting the data and maybe getting it in the right way. And so, having this expectation communicated and for yourself, but also for others in the project is really useful. And it's quite a good idea to involve any kind of IT contacts, whether it's the data administrator or some data specialists who will help you prepare the data, to make them also a little bit enthusiastic about process mining and to explain what you're doing, because then they also understand maybe better what you're looking for and can support you in a better way.
Yeah. Yeah, and then if we are diving a bit deeper, right? So, of course, if we are looking at a role, if we are looking at the system administrator, and if we even look past the system administrator, then there is a system, right? So often the question is, where does the data then physically come from, right? So people quickly relate to either a database, for example, but it could also be different things, right? So it could be a system, it could be a file, it could be a log. And so
data warehouse.
A data warehouse, it's more abstract. It can be very structured in a sense. So if you have a database, relational database, then often the data is very structured. But if you kind of have an archive of documents, contracts for physical contracts which are scanned in, or posts which are scanned in, then they have a timestamps of when they are scanned in. But the data of the actual object is unstructured, right? So if you can find a way to make that more structured data, then of course it would also be reusable for a process mining point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Another question that we get a lot is what's about manual activities, right? Do we get that also a lot, really?
Yeah. So often that's one of the first questions. So when we kind of do an awareness session where we show process mining capability and then have a discussion about it, then one of the first questions is, okay, how do I deal when I don't have the data? And I think we are getting to that point eventually somewhere down the line. But one of the first questions is, what if I have some of these activity being logged, but some of the work is done outside of the system? For example, I have a workflow system that kind of supports request of loans for the underwriting process, but some part of the decision making is done completely out of the system. They are using paper or something else in order to do the final decision and not log every step along the way. And the question is that an issue? Is that a problem?
Yeah. And people ask about it, I think, because they are aware that that's just the reality, right? Organizations use different systems, first of all, often not just one system, but processes are supported by different systems, and not everything is supported by a system, but there are these manual steps where you maybe do something on the phone or through email or just outside of the system. And they are essential parts of the process. And I think it's a little bit like all or nothing kind of worry, right, that people have. Like, if I have these manual activities, maybe then I can't do process mining at all. And I think it's really important to realize that you start with the data that you have, and it can be very well be that there are some gaps or some blind spots. And of course, if you don't have data about a particular step, because process mining is a data analysis technique, you won't see those steps, right? So that's why we refer to them as blind spots, because also in the process maps that you discover, you will see the steps that happen before and afterwards, for example, that are somehow registered in the system. But then where the manual activity is, it looks like there's a big kind of delay, right? Or kind of a long time that something takes. But in reality, it's not actually that nothing happens there, but there are these manual activities that you don't see. And so what is important is that you're aware of the existence of these manual activities, and to know that you have those blind spots to interpret what you're seeing correctly. But start with the data that you have, and only if exactly in that area of the process you have the biggest problems and you realize you need some bigger visibility, then it's worth going into in a second iteration, for example, to collect some data in this place.
Yeah, and sometimes it's deliberate, right? So, for example, if you're looking at an ER, and then often they are logging very concretely when a patient enters the ER and when it leaves the ER. And of course, in the ER, a lot of things happening, right? So a lot of procedures as well. But they don't have the time in order to do the logging at that given moment in time, right? So they are really working on the patient and not doing the administration at that given moment in time. And so, of course, there are other ways, either to observe or maybe to do a video capture or these kind of things. But they don't want to include a lot of administration at that given point in time. So you also have to realize, was there a particular reason why the data was not collected? Or would it be beneficiary to introduce something that makes it easy to collect the data? Because having additional, as you can collect, of course, the data manually, but that requires to have additional work in order to get this kind of as a result back. And then you need to make a strong case before you actually can do this. Otherwise, you create a lot of irritation as part of the process.
And you don't have to, that's the thing, you only do it if you only do any kind of manual data collection if you need it. So I would never start with that. I would always start with the data that you already have and then see.
And I would never continue with the data collection manually, only a sample. So, for example, I've done this in the past, but just a few days or just a week, just to get an impression and then try to make some bold calculations based upon the data what you have then. And the nice thing is that you can extend your process mining analysis also based upon the manual collected data, right? So then you kind of have a time slice where you can see at least unlock the black box and then see kind of deeper what happens and analyze that particular part, but would not continue this forever because it would create too much irritation.
Exactly. What are some of the other common questions that you see?
So of course, where the data is coming from, but also how do I deal with large data sets, for example? So there can be some challenge that people would see, okay, I have this ERP system, it contains millions and millions of rows, where do I start, right? So then you are getting lost quite quickly just by the immense sheer number of data and how to handle the data if you don't have the capability to handle that amount of data. So I also often see kind of a boundary for yourself. This amount of data I can handle, but if it gets bigger, then either technically it breaks down or functional, it would not be easy to deal with this. And then you need to think about, okay, how to deal.
And you know already that you need to go through multiple iterations, right? So it really makes sense to start with a sample of a small piece first to understand and look at the data.
Exactly, and then you can also understand how difficult it is to get it into the right format, and then it's easier to understand how these pieces kind of are relating to each other. How far do we want to get? Often what I see in practice, one of the other pitfalls is that people get very ambitious from the start, and that's good, right? So they look at process mining and then see this ideal end-to-end process that being mined, right? So we need data from the call center system, then we need the data from the CRM system to get all these interactions with the customer, and then create an offer. And when that offer is being accepted, then we need to have these orders from the ERP systems. And these orders are then being delivered also as part of the ERP system. And then we send an invoice from the invoicing system. And then even we capture the feedback, right, from the customer kind of as a loop back, how it was. And all these different type of systems, of course, have relationships. So then you need to find some commonality, the common case ID, what we refer to. But it's also very challenging because you are then talking about all these systems that need to be aligned up. We're assuming that all these systems collect all the data points necessary in order to make this analysis. And finally, if there is some kind of gap, it kind of gets broken down, either at the beginning or at the end, right? So if I have a call center and I get a phone number, but that phone number is not relatable to something in my CRM system, how am I dealing with this? You get all these complexities. It would be good to start small.
Start maybe with one system or two, right?
Yeah, and then also start with a system where you can already contribute from a value point of view. So if you see problems kind of in the ordering process or in the customer interaction process, start either with the CRM system, with the ERP system, and then along the way try to extend, right? Try to group and merge these two data sets together, and then start to grow the whole end-to-end process.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can go on with data. Your data is never perfect, and that's also kind of the awareness that has to be there when you start with your process mining exercise. The data will not be ideal from the start.
Yeah. Yeah. But which system to start with and which process to start with, that's actually something also we can include in the show notes. We have like a guide that can help you a little bit if you're in that stage where you're still thinking, should I start with this process or with that process? It can give you some guidance, like which process you should pick in the beginning.
Yeah.
I think maybe one of the most common questions that I get is like, how difficult is it? How much time will it take to prepare the data? And of course, the answer is it depends, right? You know that. I think probably everyone who asks that question knows that, but they're still hoping like there's this one simple answer. But the truth is, it's really very different. I mean, I also see people who are assuming that it's always very complicated, but it doesn't have to be. There are some systems, for example, if you think of, for example, IT service management systems, the data is there. There's the history of all the, you have the ticket number as the case, all the status changes are logged. So some of these systems have some kind of export CSV button, which puts out the data in exactly the format that you can put it in the process mining tool. And you don't have to do any data preparation. That's kind of the easy case. But there are also others where you have to put a lot of data preparation work.
Yeah, and so some people also ask, right? So how much time will it take in order to get my data, get it out and get it right? And so it also depends very much on the situation and on the system which you are looking at. So we see that over the years, so we are doing this already for quite some time, but over the years the systems are getting better in order to get this data, right? So it becomes more common to have this type of logging available. So it's easier somehow to get it. But it still requires a lot of effort in order to get it exactly in the way how you want it to be and what the type of questions you are answering. And so if you are looking at a first analysis, then it can take up to 80% of the effort in order to get the data right. But of course, all the knowledge you kind of have developed in order to do this first can be reused for every future analysis later on.
Yeah, I think these are two really important points. So it's kind of a general rule of thumb, right? That people often who are working in data analysis or data mining, or they say, well, 80% is data preparation. I think it's good to just take that into your planning, with your planning into account, so that in your project plan you have really more data than more time than you think for this part, to allow for these kind of iterative cycles.
So but I also have examples where it was easy as sending an email with an example data set, and just in a few hours I get exactly what I needed, right? So in a lot of cases it's not that complex, but it kind of depends what you are looking at and what type of system and how the data is kind of hidden into the system.
And that's where you build up experience for this over time. So once you know what kind of data you need for process mining, you know what to look for and where it could be suitable. And also when you get the data, you know whether it's suitable or not. And that's also something that we wanted to briefly cover, like some of the points that you can check once you have some data. You can look at it, and we have this data suitability checklist that we will link to in the show notes. But there are 3 points that are very clear if you know about it, but a lot of the times people don't realize it. So we wanted to show that as a reminder. So maybe if we go back to the slides, we can see just the 3 minimum data requirements that we need for process mining. Right, we need a case ID, an activity name, and a timestamp, of course. So that's what we are referring to, that what people are getting the experience to know for how they look for these 3 ingredients, right, in their data. And then you think about, okay, for this process that I want to analyze, what will be my case ID, what will be my timestamp, what will be the activities in the process. So yeah, that's what you're looking for. But when you get some data set back, it's good to keep in mind that for the case ID, you are looking for a data set where you have multiple events referring to the same case, right? So if you don't have multiple case IDs in your data set, then it's probably just an event ID. And you need, in a process, you have sequences of activities that relate to the same case. So if you have just one event per case, you don't really have a process. So you need multiple steps that are linked together with case ID. So the case ID, you need to have multiple rows. For example, like here we see there's 7 rows all related to case ID C360, right? So they all belong to the same case. Now, if we go to the second requirement, it's the other way around. So here we have a status attribute, and it looks like, oh, the status could be my activity name. That's great. But you look at it, and for the activity name, you actually need to see changes in the activity over time. So here, for the same case, if you always have the same activity or status, it's not, you're missing the history. You're not having historical information about this activity, right? So it's maybe the last activity that happens or the current status, but you're missing the activity history. So what you're looking for is something like this. So this is a good example where you see for this case C360, you see different steps, different activities that happen over time. And the same that holds for the activity is also what you're looking for with the timestamps. So here, you're looking for timestamp information, but often that's something, it seems that you have timestamps in your data, but look carefully if for the same case you actually see those timestamps changing, right? Because here it's the same timestamp for all events, for all activities. So it's not really a timestamp in the process mining sense, where you mark the moment of when this particular activity happened. It's more kind of more like a data attribute, like, for example, the time when the case was created or the time a purchase was made or something like that. So also for timestamp, you're looking actually for different timestamps for the same case. So the data suitability checklist is, I think, a good kind of checklist that you can use once you have some data and you need to decide, is it a good one, right? Or do we need to go through another iteration?
Yeah. So that's also, of course, the challenge, right? So when you start requesting the data and you get something back, you need to check it whether or not the data is actually suitable. But if you are missing something, then you can do 2 things, right? You can say, we don't have it, and we stop there. But often it also helps to dig a bit deeper, right? So to give an example, sometimes you can look for data in a data warehouse, for example, and then they have a lot of data available and can deliver something. But you see that you are missing something, either a case ID or a timestamp. And then if you request the same data at the production system, they tend to have it because they don't take all the data into a data warehouse, for example. And so, and the same thing holds for a system, right? So people are starting looking in the database to see whether they can find all these timestamps on documents or document changes, for example, and then they have it somewhere else. They have kind of a different separate file where they keep track of all the changes that happen to a particular document.
Yeah, maybe the workflow system that contributed the data that ended up in the data warehouse or in the reporting, right?
So it's I think also a common practice not to just accept the answer, but really work through the process and dig a bit deeper to see how far you can get to really understand what is then actually missing. And so it could be that you don't have all the ingredients, but then you are certain what is missing. But that's also kind of the starting point in order to try to influence the whole part, to make sure that if you are taking a next iteration, that you also improve the quality of the collection system of your data. And it's not easy, right? So you cannot change the system tomorrow or collect the data tomorrow. I have some examples where this happened. But it can at least lead to some of the requirements that can be taken into account when you are changing the system or when you start onboarding a new system, for example. And that's what we've seen a lot for especially the companies that are doing process mining already for quite some time, that they have very specific requirements for the onboarding of these new systems.
Yeah.
And their data becomes richer along the way. So if they didn't start process mining 6 years ago, for example, they wouldn't have this. And so it also kind of creates this need and this requirement and improvement of the quality of these logs eventually.
Yeah, exactly. Mm.
Yeah, one of the examples that are very interesting where they were able to do it is an introduction of kind of a mobile app or an app, a website app. And they had kind of a traditional way to have a sales conversation more physically. And then they started to introduce an app to kind of give advice before they actually have this discussion. And this app, of course, is kind of tracking user behavior. And they were seeing each individual user behavior as part of the app, but they were not be able to relate this to a particular customer. And so then they saw that they had this technical logging, that you have this timestamp, you have each individual interaction that actually took place. And it was not easy, right? Because you have all these interactions or all these system loggings, but then you need to take out all these user interactions that take place. But they needed to add this customer identification as part of this. And they didn't think about having this in this particular log. So they added. It was not that complicated, but it required that step. So you cannot assume that it's already there. So they needed to put some effort in order to have this. And then when they did, they were able to join both the information from the CRM system with the information from the online app. And then a whole rich view came into play, because then you would be able to see how is this customer interacting, right? So do they use the app first, or are they contacting the sales representative? Or how is the play with the sales representative and the app? So how are they working together? And so the whole new perspective is kind of unlocked just by adding this additional information.
Yeah, that's a nice example, and it's like also showing that we were talking earlier that people want to know how difficult is it to get the process mining data ready and make it available. But apart from being different systems, having different levels of difficulty, the difficulties that you encounter are also in different places, right? The example that you just gave was about the case ID. So basically the case ID was missing to connect these systems. And that's one of the things, if you want to look at process mining at the end-to-end process, the end-to-end process scope is determined by the case ID. So even if different case IDs are used across different systems, then you need to be able to make a mapping. Sometimes you have a custom ID or something that you can find back in all of the systems. Like in your example, they were adding that. But if you have different systems, you have to be at least able to map it. And if that's not possible, then you can't do it. So then it's really a requirement that's missing to be able to analyze this end-to-end process. And once you realize that you could do that and how valuable that would be, then it becomes practical to add that data link. Basically.
And when you start doing this, also the interesting thing is of course, sometimes if you are doing something in an app or if you are doing something on a website, a lot of people anonymized, right? So they are there, but we don't know who they are. And so at the moment they are interacting, we don't know who they are. But eventually, if they purchase something, we know who they are. Right, so it's also something.
The bank, you mean when in the bank, if they're logged into, for example, in their kind of customer account or something?
Yeah, but also when you buy something at Amazon, for example, then eventually you can browse for products, and eventually you log in, and then you buy something, and then you kind of show who you are. And so also from a process mining point of view, you kind of track back. So then you can see further in the history to see all the interactions that took place. So maybe you can even go back to the Google ad, which kind of triggered you to go to the Amazon page where you were looking something, right? So in this way, it requires some kind of design of the process, and that requires also some kind of design of your case ID, I think. And eventually you need to do the same thing for the timestamps. So often people are starting analyzing their processes. So if we are looking at business processes again, then we say, I'm missing something here. right? But the logging, the system was kind of developed to support the administrative part of the process.
Yeah.
And that administrative part of the process doesn't include the whole process or the whole story. Yeah? A lot of things maybe happen outside of the system or different systems.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing is the timestamp. You mentioned timestamp, but the timestamps are often linked to the activity, right? So that's, of course, the time of the activity. So if you're missing timestamps, you're maybe missing certain steps in the process. But if you're missing certain steps in the process, what you have to look for in the systems are timestamps. So maybe you don't have like an activity name, but it's just a data field somewhere in the database table with a date. Or if you're lucky, date and time, but then you know, okay, that's the time of that activity, and then you make that your activity with the timestamp there. So you need to know what you're looking for, and you create that event log for your analysis.
Yeah, and it could also be other things, right? So if I have a workflow system and that workflow system arrives at an activity, create quote, for example. Then creating the quote is composed of sub-activities. So if I want to create a quote, and maybe I need to translate to a different currency, so then I need to open something in order to recalculate the currency or based upon the current rates. So then I open the app, I have this exchange rate, I calculate the actual rate, and then I need to create the eventual offer. Each of these steps are not part of the workflow system itself, right? So it's something I do, but these things are timestamped. So somehow I may be able to collect these timestamps if they become very necessary as part of my analysis. So that's what I was thinking about when we are missing timestamps. We are missing also activities, but these timestamps of these activities are not being logged because they were never part of the design of this particular workflow system. They maybe were part of the design of the process, but not of that workflow system. And there is kind of a mismatch between both of them, right? So what our ideal logs look like and what we can get from the systems.
Yeah, and I think that's what people are thinking about if they're asking about manual activities, and so because they know that there are all these things that maybe are not reflected. Probably cannot be found in the data. But so we have been talking a lot about the ingredients that we need and how to find them, how difficult it is to find them, and things like that. But let's say that you have all the ingredients. It still is often the case that you still need to do something with the data, that it cannot be used as is, but you have to transform it somehow, put it in a different shape, put different files together. And so what we also wanted to do here today is to show you two common examples. And we will show this just based on Excel in a very simple way, because we want to demonstrate you conceptually how you're looking at these problems, right? And to illustrate the things that you have to keep in mind for yourself. Technically, right, Rudi, we see people use all kinds of tools. What kind of tools do you see people use for making really data transformations or merging in practice?
So more traditionally SQL, of course. A lot of data is residing at a relational database. So when they get it out, they also use SQL to get it into the right format. But more complex transformations are done in ETL tools. And so especially if you have bigger data sets, then this is a good common practice. But also more technical people are using Python, for example, or R as scripting languages in order to prepare the data. But we also don't have to underestimate the power of just common Excel, right? So especially if you show an example, it's easy to explain. It's very accessible for everyone. And that's also one of the best practices. Just request a smaller data set. We show you in a couple of moments a simple example, just a few cases, right? But if you use these few cases, you can already show how the data kind of should be prepared. And it doesn't mean that you cover all the scenarios that are in your actual data, but at least people understand how they should combine this together. So it reduces a lot of these complexities.
Logically, right? And then you can give it, for example, to the data specialist, and they do this for the whole big data set for you.
Yeah, so it's kind of creating the requirements, right? Without writing 70 pages of documentation of how to do this. But if you can explain which steps you actually took in order to prepare the data for the small data set, and a data scientist would look at this and then would say, it just would take me 30 minutes. Well, if the data scientist wouldn't know what you want to do, then it would say, it'd take me at least 3 weeks in order to get this done, right? Because it doesn't know how complex it is.
Exactly, yeah. And what we see a lot is that the people are just using the tools that they are comfortable with, right? Or that they're familiar with. It doesn't always have to be the best tool. For example, at some point in time, I was used a lot to programming in PROM, like the PROM framework, the process tool. Yeah. And then if I had to program anything, I was programming some kind of PROM plugin, because that wasn't the most suitable way to do it. But for me, it was the fastest way, because I knew how to do it.
Yeah, that's also, especially if you are doing this in iterations, often what I saw myself doing is kind of the same thing, is when you are doing this for the first time, just to keep it simple, right? So it's more or less the goals instead of the means, right? So the means eventually become a big discussion, how to bet this in, who is going to do this for you, and these kind of things. But especially when you are doing this for the first time, you just want to have the goal of having this data, right? And then do this. And I think another nice example is from an auditing use case we have, where we had 2 auditors, which were collecting data from SAP. And it's not always easy, right, to get this data from SAP and get it prepared. And they are not data experts. By far, right? So they just went into this journey and they did it themselves, right? So they could kind of request this as a separate project, even to prepare the data. But eventually they powered through and they collected the data from the different tables from SAP, even external system, and then prepared the data to get this ready for their process mining exercise. And then even realized that they actually need 2 data sets in order to get it right, and one from the order perspective and the other one from the invoice perspective. But they did get it.
They did it themselves. And the advantage is, if you do it yourself, then you really know also the choices that were made, right? There are certain choices that you have to make, and you can then, you're really conscious of those decisions. So maybe let's look at the first example that we brought, right? So it's indeed a very simple example, because it's just one case. Let me see if you can see it on my screen. It should be there now. So really, what kind of data are we looking at here? It's like 2 data sets, and we know we need to put them together, but we don't know yet how they relate to each other, right? So how would we approach this?
So what we see here on the left is data collected from a website. So these are clicks, what we often refer to as click streams, right? So we have, in this case, a customer ID, which is a customer, but you can also refer this to a session ID, for example, or an IP address. And this customer is clicking through the website.
And it's just one case, it's just one customer. We see all of these 37 steps are all relating to the same customer ID.
So in the original data file, we have more, right? But we just collected one example just to give you an example how you can combine this together. The second thing is, I think the most easy thing is not the timestamp, but the page name first. So the page name is the page which is visited. And of course, this is a URL in reality, but it's abbreviated to a page name. And so it's created more simple in a sense. And that's each page that is being visited. And of course, the moment at which this page is being visited, so when you click, for example, button to go to the next page, then that click is recorded as the timestamp. So this is the starting point of visiting a particular page or requesting the URL.
And that's just something. I'm coloring it here, so we see like which elements are the case ID, activity name, timestamp. But it's a good something that you would do yourself. So if you get 2 files and you think about how do they relate to each other, that's what you are doing in the beginning, right? You're looking well, for each of those, what is my case ID, what's my activity name, and what is my timestamp? And then you can make
and here it seems very obvious, but for example, as part of the training, we have an HR data set, and then we have a lot of columns, so you kind of get lost. And so if you don't do this kind of as a common practice, then you really get lost. You don't know what it is, which are the candidates, and which would be a good candidate, and which one won't. So then it makes it kind of easier to do your first iteration instead of just taking in everything. Yeah.
Exactly. And there, by the way, you are using the same checks from the suitability checklist, because if you have kind of a unique ID in each of the rows, and it's just a row ID, but it's not a case ID that's linking the cases, right? And you're looking for timestamps that are different and not the same for the whole case. So exactly the same things apply.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then on the right side?
Yeah, on the right side, it's a system where questions are being asked. So you can kind of see it as an email or a web form that's being submitted. And each question is being logged for a particular customer. So we have the same customer ID here. And then we have 2 timestamps. Yeah, so we have kind of the activity ask question, where it starts, and then maybe you can argue the term ask question, but the asking of the question starts with the requesting of that question, and it ends at answering this question. So we have a starting timestamp and completion timestamp in this case.
Yeah. So it's the answer. The end timestamp is when the answer is being given to the question?
Being submitted. Okay. Yeah. And then, of course, we have some attributes in there, and the attributes are about the question itself. So the question has a theme, then it has a sub-theme, and it even goes further, a detailed theme, and then the actual question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and when we now have to put these files together, so the question is, how do they relate to each other? And so here we do see, we see that there's information about a separate activity, right? The ask question is like an additional activity that happens in the same process for the same person, and which we don't see in the kind of the clickstream logs. It's coming from a different system, for example. But you could also imagine maybe some other scenarios. Let's say sometimes you see that there's some kind of more static information or some meta information in a different system. For example, there could be a table that has information about the type of customer, right? Maybe the customer, let's say there's different age categories, or they're in different countries or regions or something like that. And so if you have static information, you would, for example, would merge that by adding an additional attribute. So, for example, let's say we have an additional table which gives us the age category. So we would put that here as an additional attribute category. And then, for example, let's say this person is in the age category 40 to 49. So you have maybe just one entry in this kind of static data field, but you would add it as a kind of an additional field, right, as an additional attribute. So that's one thing that you see commonly, where you would add, let's say, columns, and then you link them based on the case ID. But it's different to what we have here, right? Really, here we have really activities in the second file.
Yeah. So I think the first question is how do these things relate? So if you are thinking about the process, so in this case it's clickstream interactions, visiting a website, going to the website in a particular way, and then or before asking the question. So I'm either asking the question, then go online, or I'm going online and ask the question, or I go online, ask the question, and then go back online. So we are looking kind of the interactions between these 2 interactions. And what makes these interactions common is that it's done by the same person, right? So there it begins. So the anchor point is often what we call the common case ID. So you should have a common case ID. And it looks simple here, but in practice, it can be quite challenging, right? So if we are looking at the original data, for example, we started with a session ID first, and then that person was eventually logged in, and we know we connected the session to a particular customer. So then we can relate the things to each other. But we did something extra in order to get there. So it is not always easy to find these common case ID common case IDs. Yeah.
Right. But once you have it, the case ID is what's linking the case. So that's what we were talking about before with the scope of the process, the beginning and until the end of the process. It's being determined by the case ID, right? So the case ID is when we put files together, they need to be linked. So that's why, and we just do it by copy paste here. In a data transformation, you would do it then automatically with different tools. So we would basically copy just 4 additional rows below, because these are additional events, these are additional activities. And it's important that in the same column that has the custom ID for the first data set, you put the case ID for the second data set as well, so that you can match them to the same case. Yeah,
one important remark, you don't have to worry about the order. So it can be at the beginning, can be in the middle, it can be... So the process mining tool eventually deals, based upon the timestamp, with the order of things happening. So you don't have to deal with the actual order.
Yeah. The order for the rows, exactly. So this is being automatically sorted based on the timestamps when you import the data. But then the other thing is, when you try to match the data together, you might be tempted to now also align all of the other fields. So for example, the activity, the timestamp, and that's actually something that we would recommend, right? Really, maybe not do that, but keep it flexible and keep it simple also, because they don't have to be in the same row, but we can just,
So one of the things what's obvious here is there's a difference between the clickstream data and the questions that are being asked, because for the questions, we have 2 timestamps, right? So we have a start and completion timestamp, and only for the clickstream data, we have 1 timestamp. So there's kind of a mismatch. And then the whole argument starts, is the clickstream a start timestamp or completion timestamp? It's neither, right? So it's the click. So it's on a different level,
and the same with the activity, right? Because here we have ask question, but actually we have kind of different levels of information about the activity ask question. So maybe we want to have information about ask question about payment. That's kind of the activity in a more granular level. So we don't want to decide that yet, to limit the analysis possibilities. So what do we do, right? We just add them as additional columns at the top. So we keep everything that we have in the one file, and then we just add these additional columns to the end. But then when we copy the data...
And this is somewhat counterintuitive, but it works. We just keep kind of these 2 data sets still disconnected from each other, in a sense that they are kind of separated but linked by the case ID. So here it physically shows that these things are 2 different things, but they are connected by the common case ID.
So now this is the joined data set that we can now import. So now if we go to Disco, let's see, I think I put it on the desktop. Let's see if I can find it. I think it's this one. So we can see that here, right? So we have this kind of attribute that has been added. This is our case ID, so that's an important here at the top. We have configured this as case ID. The timestamp has been detected for the first data set. Here, this is our activity name from the first one. But then at the bottom, we see those 4 rows coming from the second data set. And also the case ID is already linked here and through the first column. But then we simply configure the start and the end timestamp also as timestamps. And then now for the activities, we actually have some choice. So for example, here we can choose the ask question as our activity. Maybe we do this first, right? Just to see, what did you say, Rudi? We want to know whether they ask the question at the beginning or at the end.
Exactly. So do they ask questions before they actually go online or after they go online? So we would see it at the beginning or at the end.
So this is just this one case, right? Just the process for this one case. And we see it at the beginning, actually, right? So here at the top. So first they ask questions and then they go into the different parts of the system. But now, we still have the flexibility to do it differently. So we can go back and say, actually, maybe we also want to, which one? Maybe the sub-theme could be part of the activity as well. So we want to know which kind of questions they ask. So what we are doing is we keep the configuration of these other activity fields, but we bring in an additional dimension, which is included and therefore unfolds the activity in that way. So we can see more with a more fine-grained granularity here at the top we see the 4 questions, and we see there's actually 2 questions, right, about the payment, and then we see in which order they are asked, and then actually the process starts.
Yeah. And this gives a much easier way, without dealing with some of the complexities as part of the process when you start preparing the data. And especially if you go to the first iteration, it feels kind of counterintuitive, right, to keep everything separate and kind of as two separate data sets. But it gives you a lot of flexibility in your analysis eventually. And this kind of helps in order to decide how to prepare the data eventually. Yeah? So if you start having kind of a self-service BI set up, then this would really help how to support it in a particular way.
Yeah. And by the way, also the timestamps can have different patterns, right? Especially if you get them from different systems. It's very normal that you have kind of slash or backslash or a different kind of way of writing the timestamps, because that's how it's different in different systems. So you don't have to actually transform the timestamps into patterns. But in Disco, when you import a timestamp, it's matching automatically. But if it's not matched automatically, you can here at the top, you can determine the pattern and basically tell the process mining tool how it should interpret the data, right? But you do this per column. So you can have, for one system, can have this timestamp pattern, and then for another, from the other system, you can define a different pattern, and then it picks the right one for the one that you want. So here it's at the bottom, of course, the 4 that we see. Okay, so this was an example, what you do if you merge data. So think about how they relate to each other. If it's just additional attributes, then you won't see additional activities with new timestamps, but it will be just static data that you can add as additional columns to the existing data set. But if you have additional activities in the second file, then you need to add new rows like we just did with the 4, and you can just add it to the bottom and then have the merged file.
Yeah, and of course, if you are doing this for one case, then it would be easier to scale this up, right? So you can do it for 100, for example, if you can manage this. If you need to do more and it becomes too complicated to do it in Excel, for example, because Excel also has a limit, then you can look for other ways. And so, for example, someone else can do this for you in an ETL tool and then prepare this data, or someone else would say, I can create a script quite easily in Python in order to do it. But if you show this end result, so the input data and the end result, then it's quite easy to extract how you actually did this.
Yeah, exactly.
So with the minimum steps, so the only thing what you did is align the case ID, and the rest is kind of joined separately.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the second example that we wanted to show you is also a very common one. That's why we selected it. And maybe it's easiest if we just look at the file. So let me know when you can see it. So here we can see the Excel, right? Yeah. So this is a different data set. It's from a hospital. And here it's actually a little bit, at first we might think, okay, it's not suitable for process mining at all. Well, it's not suitable yet. We have to do something with it. But that's another thing you can watch out for if you see there's not kind of any repetition of the case ID. So before we saw there were multiple rows, right, with the same case ID, which was one of the things on the checklist. Here we see every row, it's unique. I have just one row for patient 1, one row for patient 2, one row for patient 3. But actually, we do have more information about the steps for each of the cases or each of the patients. But it's formatted differently because we can see here we have different columns, right? We have one column that gives us information. This is the admission before the surgery. So it's the surgery process. Then the second column is when the patient was ordered before the surgery. Then we have the timestamp when they entered the ER, so the emergency room. Then we have information when they leave the ER. And then what is the submission step? Is that after the operation, really? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, but we have 5 different activities actually for each of the rows. And yeah, we have some potential data quality problems here because we are not seeing loops, right? Repetitions are not captured by this format. But let's put this aside for now and just talk about, yeah, if we have this data, we need to reformat it so that we have different events for different rows. So to do this, we also wanted to again show this to you just based on a simple example, and we want to show it, and I have prepared here already with some colors, the same colors we used before, just based on 3 cases manually, so you can follow the logic of it. And then actually in the show notes we will also point to a blog post where we show not just how to do this in Excel, but we actually show also how to do it in with SQL and also with an ETL tool, and you can even download the script for that. So yeah, there are other tools, of course, to do this kind of for a larger data set than 3, but let's look at the logic.
Yeah.
Now, so how would we do this here, Rudi? Can maybe...
Yeah, so first of all, what we need is a case ID, of course, all right? And here we have 3 candidates of a case ID, which we want to have. So it's not that we decide yet which case ID would be the best. So do we want to look from a surgery perspective or from an admission perspective or from a patient perspective where we can see multiple surgeries happening? Yeah. And so we kind of keep things together. And we see that now each individual line is unique, but it needs to be repetitive. So it means that each of these activities, which are kind of now in the columns, need to become the rows. And the heading of these columns are kind of related to each of these activities. Yeah. So then we need to copy and paste first the case ID.
Right, but I think the trick here is a little bit that you don't need to do this per case, but actually you can do it per activity. Again, the order doesn't matter, so that's something that we can leverage here. But we don't have an activity and timestamp column yet. We can create them by writing activity and timestamp. And now actually we can do it per activity. So we would, if we do it for 3 cases here, we would copy the 3 case IDs, like we just said. We want to keep all of them to keep the flexibility for that analysis. So we have that, but then I think it's like that. So now we are taking the name of the column header. In this case, tells us what activity this is, right? So this is the name of the activity. We could make it more pretty or more expressive, but we just keep it like as a technical name here. And then, we have the timestamp. So, the activity name is actually now for all of the cases, of course. We are
it's the same.
Capturing this.
And
now
again,
I'm doing this.
And again, we don't have to deal with the order, right? So sometimes people think, I have to have it in a neat order, or I need to group all these cases together based upon the patient number, for example, or the admission number. You don't have to deal with this. It can be in arbitrary order as long as it has a common case ID. And so we see that, for example, now for the first patient, we kind of get a repetition of the second activity. And so the process mining tool figures out by itself which patients belong together or which admissions belong together. And then the timestamp is being used for the order.
And I'm now doing this also for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th one. So it's a little bit.
This is.
Can watch. I'm not making any mistakes.
Yeah, I do.
But we already see here that we're going into and out of the ER, right? So this is something that I think we will come back to in a moment. So we have 2 more. So this is the leave activity. So we have enter and now leave.
And again, you can do this for a whole column, right? We are doing this for 3 cases, but if you do the same thing and copy the whole column, then you get kind of the same result for everything altogether. Yeah, in the example blog post, especially if you do it with an ETL tool, I think it's just one transformation activity. It's called unpivot, and then the whole data set kind of unpivot in this direction.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of the easy kind of ETL scripts, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so almost done. So it's the fifth and last activity, and again we are copying the timestamps for the 3 cases for that particular activity. Yeah, and so now we have transposed. It's often called, right? Transposed the data.
Yeah. Yeah. So from the rows we went to, from the columns we went to the rows.
Yeah. And in a way, of course, we could now already go and import that. So if we go back to Disco, let's see how that looks. Probably not a very advanced process, right? So which one is it? It's a hospital example. Transposed. Yeah, so we can see. Yeah. Of course, the case IDs are, well, we can choose now, right? So should we use the patient ID maybe, or surgery ID? Maybe surgery number is a good case, right?
Yeah, surgery is good, yeah. Yeah, I think surgery and admission is in most cases kind of the same. And you can even include the patient number and the surgery, because surgery is on a lower level.
Yeah, and so, we could make a combination. So if we combine all 3, then we will concatenate all 3, and the case ID is being built as a combination of the 3.
Cool.
So now if we import this, we see a sequential process, right? But actually we can, if we go back, we can, it also shows like you have to think about how you want to look at the data and how you want to look at the process. And that can influence also how you build up your data. So there's not this one way to create the data, but you can shape that a little bit. And I think here it's a nice example because we have the 2 timestamps when we enter and leave the ER, right? So it's actually a duration for the activity.
Yeah, so in the process map you can also see it, right? So you see somewhere when you enter the ER and eventually you leave the ER. But of course, these activities are kind of belong together. So you can see this kind of as one step that's actually happening. And then it's weird that you have an enter and leave ER step, because you conceptually see this kind of as one thing, because nothing else happens in between. And then, of course, you can group them together to see them kind of as a start and an end. An activity with one start and an end.
So that's something we would add an additional column. That's best probably, right? If we wanted to.
So common practice is here, or best practice is to leave the data as original as possible. Often when I start transforming my data, then I have this common practice to add new columns instead of changing the existing columns, because then I create kind of traceability for myself to see how I extended the data without removing something, so that I can keep explaining what I did and have this original data available. But what we are doing now is kind of renaming that activity.
So we would call this ER, right, as a new activity, and for the other ones we would keep the data as it is. But the key is, maybe we should look at that in a moment, what we are doing with the timestamps, because we want to use the start and the completion timestamp that we have for this ER activity, right? So actually we are not using those, right?
Leave ER. No, because we now have the activity ER that kind of describes the start and the end as timestamp.
Yeah. So would we then also call this the start timestamp and add a complete timestamp? Maybe, right? So we could rename this.
No, so I would create a new timestamp, the start timestamp and end timestamp. So we can always import it in the way how we originally created it, but then have also the option to import it in a new way. And so keep it as flexible as possible.
Yeah.
And now we can copy the whole column as starting timestamp. We have to now cut out the leave timestamp and then make that the end timestamp.
Yeah. And these are the 3, So they are belonging to the leave timestamp activity here, or the leave timestamp event. And these are the timestamp that we are cutting now in the end timestamp for the ER activity.
Yeah, so we have the original data, which is the timestamp, but now you have these empty timestamp, which are important for the start and the end timestamp for the leave ER, because the leave ER are now part of the ER activity. And what sometimes people don't realize is that you can mix and match, right? So sometimes you can just have one timestamp, but mix it with activities with the start and a completion timestamp. So it doesn't have to be all the same.
Yeah, and again here the tip would be to leave the data as much as it is, to keep it simple, but also like you mentioned, to have still the old data in there, and it makes it easy. So if we are looking now at the same data set and we are looking at the import screen, we would configure the import a little bit differently. So as activity name, we would use now the new activity. We could have called it new activity, but just use it as the activity here. And then we would not use the previous timestamp, the event timestamp. So we would, for example, remove that or put it as an attribute. But we use those two timestamps, so the start and the completion timestamp. And then we see actually that there are some rows which are empty now, but they will be removed, right? So because if you have events that don't have any timestamp, then they can't be put in the right sequence in the context of the process. So they will be just not imported at all. So actually we don't have to delete these events, because that's actually during the import step that happens automatically. We can leave it as it is. So when we import the data, we will get
this message.
We'll get a warning that these three are empty, which we know that's exactly what we wanted to do. So once we say, okay, now we can actually see that there's a iteration, right, for this particular activity.
So it uses that activity with a start and completion timestamp.
Yes.
And now the process becomes simple as well, right? Because we had an additional activity in the previous example, and this is much easier to read, of course.
Yeah, so that's, again, there's no one right or wrong way to do this, but you have to think about how do you want to look at the process, how do you want to look at the activities, and where do you see the delays? Do you see the delays associated to the activities or to the times between the different steps? Or how are the people who have the domain knowledge looking at the process? So you try to create process maps that reflect closely to the way that you think about the process and how you want to look at it, to analyze it, and to improve it. So I think that's an example for that. And the other thing we wanted to show, right, is maybe talk a little bit more about the attributes, because before we were showing this example of this case attribute where we had the age category, which we just added, and then you can use this for filtering and for different types of analysis. But when you have attributes, it's also worth thinking about, well, is this a case attribute that's kind of static for the whole case, or is this an attribute that reflects or refers to just one particular activity in the process? And we have an example here, right? So in this case, in this process, the room, right? The room really refers to the operating room in which the surgery takes place. So it's only related to the ER activity. So in fact, if we want to include that attribute, we would not include it like for the whole case, for every event, but we would just associate it, and we can put it as ER room as an additional column like before. But then we only put it for the ER activity. And we see that for the three cases here, we have two different rooms. So again, if we go back and import the data, of course, also here the tip would be, again, to keep it separate, like in separate columns, because then you have the choice. But we can actually now include the ER room as an additional dimension in our activity to unfold the ER activity with respect to which different rooms it takes place. Yeah,
and that's the specific reason, right, why we want to have it kind of as an event attribute instead of a case attribute, right? So because then we can extend it as an activity.
Exactly, because what we see now is if we have our activity here, so that's the activity that we had before, but then this is also configured as activity, but because it's empty for the other activities where this is not relevant, only the relevant activity or the event where the event attribute is associated will be unfolded, right? So you can again think about how you want to look at the process, what you want to unfold and what not. And in this case, it's a very targeted unfolding of this ER activity, again, the 3 rows which are empty, which we expect. So only the ER activity is unfolded in this way, based on the room, right? And we keep the flexibility. We can look at it on the high level or on this detailed level, like before, when we could look at just ask question, where the ask question activity happens in the overall process, or we could unfold it in the different dimensions. But so here it's kind of it's a good example, I think, for an event attribute to use like that. So these are the 2 examples I think that we wanted to share, because these are very common activities, like merging files. So what do you have to look for? How you put them together? How do you look at this logically? And then this transpose, right? Because the data often comes out of like a reporting system or a data warehouse in this kind of column-based format. It's something that I see quite a lot.
Yeah, and then of course, so these are 2 examples where we have the data. But if we don't have the data, what should we do then?
That's a good question. That's of course something that also is quite common, right? That people say, well, I don't have any data. What do I do now? And actually, so if someone says they don't have data, so it's always good to ask further, like what's the specific situation? Because sometimes it also happens that maybe you are a process analyst and you want to use process mining to support the business units in your organization, and you go to the business unit who's interested in process mining. You say, well, I need these and these data requirements. Can you look, or can you tell me if you have data? And they come back and say, oh, we don't have that data, right? It's like, I think, related to what we talked about before. You have to become more involved. You have to actually maybe go and understand what the process behind it is. And if there are certain systems that are used to do the work, then there will be some kind of data. It's very rare that there's no data at all. I mean, there are few paper-based processes nowadays, right?
Yeah, I see a different type of challenges, right? So one of the common things, especially sometimes I see it in government, is that they have systems that are maintained outside of their organization. Right? So and then it's very difficult for them to request the data from third parties, or maybe it's a cloud-based system and they don't have direct data access, right? So they need to use some kind of API in order to get the data out. So I think the challenge can be twofold. It can be a technical challenge, that they sometimes see, there is data, but it technically is kind of a challenge because I don't have the knowledge in order to get it out myself, and I need particular skills in order to do so, and that requires budget or resources to do. And so then it's a more technical challenge. But it could also be another type of challenge, is that you get a very concrete question, where the first time when you start applying process mining, then becomes a challenge because you want to answer the question and you are missing something. So it could also be, I have the case that I'm missing an attribute, so I cannot answer this question, right? So the whole process mining exercise goes out of the door because of missing this attribute. And then it's also good practice to, when you are doing this for the first time, to keep things a little bit more open in the scope, because you don't know whether or not the data is exactly in this particular format available for you. And so it could mean that you need to do in the second part the next iteration in order to get it exactly in the way how you want it to be. And often then it's a good practice to keep your initial questions more broad, right? To understand the process. Or maybe to have different type of options of different processes for which you evaluate which one is the best candidate in order to get started with process mining. To build some experience, and when you have this experience, then of course it's easier to look at other processes to see what kind of requirements are fulfilled or not fulfilled, or what kind of data extensions you need to take.
It's a good point, because you also sometimes need to get more experience with process mining to actually understand which questions you can ask, right? If you just ask, for example, a team to give you the questions that you should answer for them with process mining, they don't know yet what process mining is, and maybe they come up with very more KPI reporting type of questions, which of course you can answer with process mining, but maybe you could have also answered it in a different way. Yeah. So being a little bit more open and also learning about the types of questions that you can answer is a good point.
And another type of discussion, and sometimes I see the discussion is kind of as part of the beginning of the data extraction, that you kind of get into this pitfall where a big project is kind of getting started and the BI team or the reporting team or the data warehousing team becomes involved, and all these kind of requirements kind of brought up how we are going to do this in the future, how we're collecting data, where's the data sitting, and then it becomes very big from a technical point of view without having to show the value at first. So that's kind of the other perspective. And then it's also balancing out this. So often what I see in practice is it's the best way to build some experience to understand really, first of all, who is going to do this particular exercise. So is this more an analytical exercise, diagnosis exercise that's performed by a smaller group? And then it's not that it needs to be published to a very broad range of users, but as a small group of users, can they use it just on a file-based format, or do they need to have a connection some sorts? How regular do they want to do it? Would it on a month-to-one basis be enough, or should it be every day, or should it be every 5 minutes, for example? And I think that these kind of discussions can only be good when you need what you need, and it can also change for every process, right? For every process it can be slightly different.
And the good thing is, once you start looking, you see quite quickly, like, is the data suitable, what you have, and then you can take the next steps. So what do you think? Did we cover most of the common questions that we usually see? Is there something else that you think about?
So if you look at data extraction, I think we have.
What's the weirdest process that you have seen people mine?
There's so many different type of processes where you can apply process mining. So one of the interesting ones is actually eye tracking movement. So they are using eye tracking movement to check or evaluate websites, for example. And then, of course, the user interactions that take place in combination with the eye tracking is kind of interesting. And then they collect also for the eye tracking timestamps. And then the eye tracking is combined with the clickstream data, and then it's very interesting.
No, that's interesting. I really like still the example from Philips Healthcare. I mean, last time on the Café we were talking about quality management services, but earlier they were actually analyzing the MRI machines, right? So really how it's a different kind of usability or customer journey process, but then how people are using actually those machines and to improve the usability and reliability of them. So it's
and also in the creativity of how to get this data, right, when it is not there. So I've seen examples where they put on videos and then have kind of QR codes on the boxes of products that kind of pass around, and then of course you can record timestamps based upon
to follow the case ID also, right?
And then they started to be very creative and put these QR codes also on the workers, for example, and then see the resources as well as part of the whole process. So so there are different ways in order to get the data eventually. If you don't have it, then you can be creative.
It's something that we see a lot. It's like once you start getting into the topic, you will get this kind of vision for what could be process mining data, and you will think about what's the case ID, do I have a case ID, activity name, timestamp, and these are always the first things that you ask yourself if you want to analyze a process, because these are the things that you're looking for, and it all starts there.
And I think it also evolves, right? So if we ask ourselves the question, if we look at these customers which are doing this for 10 years, 6 years, 3 years, for example, what do we see evolve, right? So I think we see evolve the skill in order to do so. So that's often the first thing where they invest in. How does this work? Can I understand this? Who can develop this capability in order to do this in practice? But also in the second iteration, it kind of puts effort in improving the data. And that's where that evolves as well, right? So data quality issues that maybe can be corrected in a data warehouse or somewhere where they work on data quality. So that's one. But also at the point where they start collecting the data. So when they have opportunities to implement a new system, for example. So I've seen a point where they did an extensive process mining analysis, then they had the opportunity to introduce a new case-based system, or I think it's low-code, where they kind of configure these type of systems. And then they started to implement these systems with start and end timestamps. And then they would be able to calculate rework and then have much better business cases in order to eliminate this rework as part of the system. So then you see kind of the rework is implemented in the new system, but the new system gives you the opportunity to remove the rework from the process. And that's a very, I think, a very interesting way to do it.
Yeah, that's of course ideal if you can influence the logging, because then you can also ensure that you have timestamps that are actually detailed, and maybe you have time and not just the date, but maybe even milliseconds, so you get them in the right order, right? So we didn't talk much about data quality today, but of course this, again, it's a process and it's an iterative cycle that people go through, and each time you learn something and you build up more expertise for the next process mining project.
Yeah, and technically it's also changing over time, because I think 6, 7, maybe 10 years ago, it was an issue to collect all the data, right? So they got this logging, they had this logging available, but it could not be turned on because the price of persisting the data exactly. The storage was too expensive. So they would say, we are not using this data, so please turn it off, because otherwise it will be too expensive to store all this data and we don't need it. Right. So and the storage, of course, is not an issue anymore. So it's kind of normal. You can scale it up in these cloud-based solutions. So it's so you can just turn it on. So it's less of a problem. So also these kind of things are changing. But other aspects become important as well, and that's more the privacy and security aspects of it. So then you have to deal with these aspects as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. So maybe it's time to close the session with a short recap, just as a reminder of the things that we have discussed. So I think what has become really clear is that event logs are something that you make, right? It's not something that the system either has or has not, and if it doesn't have the event log, then you can't do process mining. It's not at all. So if there's a system that's supporting the process, most likely the data is there, and you have to go kind of get it out for your analysis. And you can find these challenges in different areas. Right, it doesn't have to be the case ID, what we have given as an example. Sometimes problems are maybe that the activities are maybe free text only, right, in a CRM system, and then maybe you have to work with the groups to maybe more look at the communication flows, or there can be all kinds of challenges in different areas, and you only know that once you have started looking. So it's always worth taking the first step, and you will see quite quickly. And what we also mentioned before, it's an essential part. Building the data, even preparing the data on a logical level, is an important part of understanding, and will be important also for your later analysis, so that you actually know that the choices that were made when the data was prepared, so that you can interpret it correctly when you analyze it. So it's not just some kind of technical thing that someone just does, but it's important to realize it's an essential part of the process mining project. And that's actually one of the tips. So if you as a process miner want to maybe build up some additional skills, of course it's always good to also learn about process improvement skills, or maybe change management skills to do kind of to support kind of process improvement projects, for example. But picking up some kind of data preparation skills can be quite useful, so that you're more independent, and you, for example, learning even to work with Excel a little bit better, or learning an ETL tool. ETL tools have the advantage that you can build up workflows in a visual way by configuring them. So you don't need any programming, and you can also store the definitions for reuse in a later way. So it's something that one can learn. And finally, when you shape the data, you can determine the view that you want to take, right? We saw that, I think, quite nicely with these two examples, that even though we were just looking at one case or 3 cases, there were different ways how we could look at the cases and also the activity dimensions. So that's something that you can take into account when you create the data, and it's something that you shape, and also you want to keep some flexibility there so that you can actually, even in the analysis, take different views, and you don't fix this one view in your data preparation. What would you add?
So getting the data and preparing the data is one of the challenges you have or need to overcome when you are starting a process mining initiative. And one of the tips is at least start small, do it step by step. You can be very ambitious. I think the long-term ambition for process mining should be big. There is a lot of opportunity. But when you start small, do it step by step, and build skills and experience on both ends of the spectrum. So on the one hand, you need to develop the skill on doing the analysis, but on the other hand, also on the data preparation, because the impact of the data preparation on the analysis and how you can extend your existing analysis is quite significant. And that requires also to learn sometimes a new skill. So we see process mining being used by auditors, by process improvers, which don't have the primary skill to work on data or preparing data. So kind of developing this skill along the way, and it doesn't have to mean that you become the expert, but at least know how these things are done, and maybe do this on smaller scale using Excel or something simple would be recommended, I think.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us for this session. We hope it was useful. Let us know if you have any additional questions about it, or any points that you see frequently, and we will share it with the community the next time. We will be back with the next Process Mining Café only in July, because in June the Process Mining Camp is taking place. Think about if you can come. Really, we encourage you. We would love to see you in Eindhoven on 21st of June. The early bird rate still applies today, so if you're quick, you can get a ticket still at a reduced rate and get your camp t-shirt as well. So that will be coming up in June, and then in July we will be back with another cafe. And again, thanks a lot for joining. See you, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.